Greetings. The title of this lecture is Christianity and Culture. And my focus is on the second half of the 20th century. In the post-World War II period, the split of Protestantism was complete. Progressive churches made little attempt to hide their preference for modernism over a literal interpretation of the Bible. The liberal Protestant churches sought to keep pace with a culture increasingly losing touch with biblical teachings. As early as the 1960s, the liberals' aggressive church politics positioned Protestant traditionalists as outsiders. For example, only 2 moderately conservative seminaries received an invitation to participate in the American Association of Theological Schools. Rejection of traditional theology continued. This is what we see at the ATS, the Association of Theological Schools. But also, if we look at the Methodists, in the case of the Methodists, one survey revealed that 60% dismissed the virgin birth of Christ as a biological miracle. Convinced that mainline church leaders had lost their biblical faith, many ordinary Americans left the progressive churches and shifted their support to churches that continued to preach a message of sin and salvation. By 1967, the conservative Southern Baptists surpassed the United Methodist Church as the largest Protestant denomination. The situation worsened for progressive Protestant denominations after 1970. They lost members, money, and missionaries. Modern views common in mainline denominations were unsettling for many Americans. Because of the Vietnam War, progressive seminaries attracted dubious students seeking to avoid military duty. One commentator's assessment of the character of the mainline student body was bleak. Quote, the first thing that strikes one about the modern theological student is that he hates the church. Progressive seminaries faced other difficulties. The cost of theological education was high with the growth of colleges and universities. And so their relative position diminished. The seminaries, the relative position of the seminaries diminished. There was financial crisis, and one commission reported that many schools were in de facto bankruptcy. The example of the Southern Baptists symbolizes the tension between modernists and traditional forces. Convinced that American culture was hostile to traditional forms of faith and that the south part of America, the southern states, had become more like the rest of the United States, traditional thinking Baptists forcefully entered the culture war seeking to hold the line against modernist influences. Their most ambitious goal was to wrest control from the hands of more progressive leaders who controlled the Southern Baptist Convention and all its agencies, including the 6 Southern Baptist Convention seminaries. In his book, Uneasy in Babylon, Southern Baptist Conservatives and American Culture, Barry Hankins claims that this episode, known as the Southern Baptist Controversy, was one of the most contentious and significant denominational battles in American religious history, and that Southern Baptists are rapidly becoming the most visible and influential force on the conservative side of what many perceive to be a cultural war, end of quote. Hankins argues that traditional evangelicals in the Southern Baptist Convention were slow to take a stand against progressives. For one thing, in the 1930 to 1960 period, there was not enough modernism in the South to cause alarm. Because there was no strong liberal secular culture earlier in the South, there was little organized fundamentalism. The cultural crisis that fundamentalists faced in the North during the first half of the century did not become obvious to the South until the 1970s. Moreover, before the 1970s, the Southern Baptist Convention represented diverse constituencies that were held together on the model of a grand compromise. The grand compromise allowed diversity, all in the hopes of maintaining unity. Progressive leading Southern Baptists had little desire to critique their culture. Into the 1970s, evangelicals began to question the wisdom of progressive Baptists allowing latitude in matters of theology. Adopting the inerrancy of the Bible as their rallying cry, these traditionalists / conservatives sought to oust the more liberal Baptists to protect the Southern Baptist Convention from theological drift to the left. One Southern conservative Baptist explained, quote, "Once you've crossed the theological Rubicon of saying that the Bible is sufficiently man's work so that it can be in error and make mistakes, then you have opened the floodgates for the individual to determine the categories which are truth, and that is an extremely presumptuous thing for man to do," end of quote. Some historians suggest that the idea of inerrancy was not an issue before the late 1970s because it took time for society to react in an organized fashion to the disturbing revolutionary decisions of the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren and to the excesses of student protesters and others during the Vietnam War, end of quote. The Roe versus Wade decision that legalized abortion in 1973 was a major landmark for future political mobilization. Of significant importance was the realization by key conservatives that the South was no longer immune to diversity, pluralism, and secularism. Hankins writes, quote, "It was as if millions of Southern Baptists, formerly at ease in Zion, had by the 1980s become very uneasy about the cultural trajectory of their religion and needed only to have their worst fears articulated by the new group of elites." Southern conservatives began to draw on the work of evangelicals outside the South to gain the necessary intellectual constructs and strategies to face modernism. The Southern Baptist controversy did not lack drama. The more progressive Baptists viewed the conservatives as troublemakers. One Wheaton College professor who switched from the progressive to the conservative side believed that modernists were on shaky grounds when they labeled biblical inerrantists morons. He knew that there were avowed inerrantists, that is, these people who believed in the inerrancy of Scripture, who were employed at various Christian colleges. He knew that these people had impressive intellectual credentials, and they certainly did not fit the critique of the moderates. Mark Coppinger, philosophy professor at Wheaton and later president of Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, stated, quote, "I was getting miffed because I was thinking, look, you're jabbing at guys like J.I. Packer and you couldn't carry their lunchbox," end of quote. When progressives charged that conservatives would ruin evangelism, others responded with data revealing that conservative-led congregations had a much higher rate of evangelistic success. One Baptist discovered that his liberal church baptized one new member per year for every 115 members, whereas a church led by a conservative had an evangelistic ratio of 1 to 15 members. Conservatives claimed that the more progressive Baptists learned the wrong lessons from the civil rights battles of the 1960s. Conservatives agreed that Baptists were right to support civil rights for African Americans and oppose racism. But conservatives believed that modernists went too far with liberalism on other issues. They, quote, bought into the whole progressivist impulse, not realizing that part of this agenda was the uprooting of religion from his historic public place within American culture. Conservatives such as Albert Mohler, president of Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, was especially vigilant of postmodernist forces. Postmodernism was destructive several ways. As he saw it, it represented the destruction of truth. For postmodernists, truth is neither universal nor objective. Second, he argued that postmodernism favors the death of the meta-narrative, in other words, the death of a grand and expansive account of meaning. This is a major concern for Christians because the gospel is the meta-narrative of all meta-narratives. Third, postmodernist thinking results in the demise of the text, with deconstructionist literary criticism. The meaning of the text is not necessarily tied to the intentions of its author, but instead can be ascribed to the text by the reader. Mohler's critique is clear. Texts which are not pleasing to the postmodernist mind are rejected as oppressive, patriarchal, heterosexist, homophobic, or deformed by some other political or ideological basis. The authority of the text is denied in the name of liberation, and the most fanciful and ridiculous interpretations are celebrated as affirming and thus authentic. All in all, postmodernism leads to the displacement of morality. If God is dead, everything is permissible. For Mohler and others, postmodernism was a more serious threat than secular humanism. Hankins makes an important distinction between conservative intellectuals and activists. Quote, for the sake of effectiveness in the political sphere, the activist must mute the ambiguity and tension inherent in many cultural matters and make bold declarations in an effort to clarify the issues. While sometimes rough around the edges and lacking in the sophistication of the more detached views of the intellectuals, the informed activist position are usually coherent, even if occasionally populist. Taking an assortment of cultural issues kept conservatives busy. One Southern conservative stated, in 1955, we didn't have a higher percentage of our population in jail than in any other country in the world. We do now. In 1955, we weren't aborting 1 out of every 3 babies. We are now. We didn't have a homosexual rights movement that was trying to make that particular sin a guaranteed constitutional right. we do now. And a woman wasn't being physically beaten every 9 seconds by her husband or by her boyfriend in 1955. They are now. 1 out of every 2 marriages did not end in divorce in 1955. And Richard Land, the author of this quote, actually continues with a number of the contrast between what was happening in 1955 versus what was happening in the 70s. So traditional thinking Baptists were convinced that American culture was experiencing a crisis. Other conservatives took control of the Southern Baptist Convention. After conservatives took control of the Southern Baptist Convention, they maneuvered to make the pro-life position the dominant and mandatory principle in all SBC agencies and seminaries. So in all the Southern Baptist Convention agencies and seminaries, they were to be promoting pro-life, a pro-life position. In 1980, 1 year after the traditionalists won the presidency of the Southern Baptist Convention, they tabled the following resolution, quote, that we abhor the use of tax money or public tax-supported medical facilities for selfish, non-therapeutic abortion, and that we favor appropriate legislation and or a constitutional amendment prohibiting abortion except to save the life of the mother. This resolution was a victory for the conservative-minded in the South and a victory for the religious right beginning to make its mark across the nation. Ed McAteer, that is spelled McAteer, one of the founders of the Religious Roundtable, an organization that mobilized conservative Christians for political action, was a Southern Baptist who was delighted with the news. By 1998, conservatives claimed that the Southern Baptist Convention was the most pro-life denomination in America, even more pro-life than the Roman Catholic Church. Turning to the issue of public education in broader American society, one can see the cultural tensions, particularly on the issues of traditional morality and parental authority. The state manipulation of youth stretches back in history. For example, since the 18th century, intellectuals such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and William Godwin promoted the goal of changing the nature of people, something they deemed possible given their rejection of original sin. It was Rousseau who thought it was a good idea to separate children from their parents and have government-owned boarding schools raise them. Godwin saw children as a sort of raw material put into our hands to mold that the next generation would be the hope of the future. It was important for children to escape the bondage inflicted on them by parents. Third-party surrogates knew better than parents on how to raise the children, so the argument went. In the second half of the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche acknowledged that government-subsidized education was meant to condition the masses into following the guiding star of the state. Of course, a clear and stark example in the 20th century was Nazi Germany. As a leftist movement, National Socialism understood the importance of manipulating children. The National Socialists wanted the children to forget the traditionalism of parents, have secularism replace Christian morality. The Nazis, quote, brilliantly replaced traditional stories and fairy tales with yarns of Aryan bravery, the divinity of Hitler, and the like. end of quote. In the United States, those concerned about the power of the government in controlling public education turned to R.J. Rushdoony's The Messianic Character of American Education. This book was published in 1963. A Presbyterian theologian and philosopher, Rushdoony argued that education had become a messianic and utopian movement of statism. He identified three assumptions of statism. One, the child is the child of the state or the property of the state, which can therefore interfere extensively with parental authority. Quote, the state priesthood of educators are best able to rear the child and prepare him for life viewed as statist life, end of quote. A third assumption is that statist education is alone objective and hence true, the state having the impartiality and transcendence of a God. One commentator wrote that Rushdoony's book became the Bible of the resistant movement. With this book, parents had access to a systematically Christian critique of the systematically anti-Christian philosophy, which undergirds the entire American public school system. In fact, in the mid-1980s, Rushdoony became an expert witness in court cases on homeschooling. So there were, beginning in the 1980s, there were increasing number of families, parents choosing homeschooling for their children. In more recent years in America and Canada, there is greater evidence of educational so-called experts asserting their roles as shapers and co-parents. Indoctrination of children in elementary school includes having them take a position on complex issues without hearing two sides. Pre-packaged conclusions dominate. Certainly, educational theorists see no place for biblical interpretation. Typically, teachers following the curriculum of the experts encourage the children to vent their emotions instead of analyzing conflicting evidence and dissecting conflicting arguments. Lost are many opportunities to have students, quote, equipped with the intellectual tools to reach their own conclusions, including conclusions different from those of their teachers. More serious is how public educators undermine Christian moral principles. While at home, parents can encourage their children to read books that challenge secular views, and they can help their children to think critically. But secular indoctrination in the schools, coupled with the hostility toward Christianity that is promoted in Hollywood and in much media, are worrisome problems. In public education, traditional morality was disappearing, usually replaced with situational ethics and moral relativism. More educational theorists see sex as a social construction. In other words, society created male and female. The idea of maleness and femaleness rooted in nature became outdated thinking. In modern educational curriculum, there is recognition of many genders. What is notable is that this transformation took place more culturally than politically. That is referring to the late 20th century. The victory over traditional biblical thinking was mainly cultural. Again, that's in reference to the late 20th century. Things are changed in the 21st century. One commentator wrote, every time a Christian mother teaches her children that God is real and that Jesus is the only way of salvation and that obeying the Bible is the only hope of happiness, she is being a cultural subversive. In 1984, hundreds of Americans gathered at 7 large cities across the United States to give testimony on public education. The focus was on proposed regulations for the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment. This amendment, passed by Congress in 1978, was in response to parents' concern about the psychological abuse of students in the classroom. The law was meant to protect students from submitting in the classroom to psychological examination, testing, or treatment that reveal information about a family's political affiliations, mental problems, income, sex behavior, and other private information. A growing number of Christians saw the new education theories as heresy. It was a sad fact that, quote, instead of teaching children knowledge and basic skills, the purpose of education had become group therapy. Criticism of the Department of Education was strong. The hearings at the 7 cities resulted in over 1,300 pages of testimony. Parents, teachers, and other citizens gave eyewitness accounts of the psychological abuse of children in public schools. These Americans, conservative activist Phyllis Schlafly wrote, quote, related how classroom courses have confused children about life, about standards of behavior, about moral choices, about religious loyalties, and about relationships with parents and with peers, end of quote. The testimonies reveal parents' dissatisfaction with the public school system, how schools alienated children from their parents and from traditional morality, such as the 10 Commandments. The testimonies clarified that parents wanted their children to learn basic knowledge, writing and math skills, not to learn that it was good to rationalize immoral and antisocial conduct when it feels good in a particular situation. Cognitive education appeared to be less important than effective education, which addressed the child's feelings and attitudes. Opponents argued that education as therapy was a dangerous path to take. This therapy included the use of violent books and films, materials dealing with parental conflict, death, and role-playing of pregnancy, abortion, divorce, hate, and suicide. There was also explicit and pornographic instructions in sex acts. Without accountability to Christian principles, the curriculum continued to push the moral limits. Examples of testimonies are as follows. One example is as follows. In Oregon, guidance counselors asked, do you believe in a God who answers prayers? Some books used by the guidance counselors declared that, quote, parents are untrained and unskilled to handle their children's problems. Edited by Phyllis Schlafly, Child Abuse in the Classroom provides valuable excerpts from the official transcript of proceedings. Actually, after the hearings that took place, the Department of Education made no effort to publish the testimonies. The hearings themselves received very little media attention. But in September of 1984, the Department of Education finally issued regulations which officially went into effect in November. The National Education Association attacked the regulations immediately. Shafley fought back, arguing that, quote, parents are the first primary educators of their children, and schools are subject to the taxpayers. This was something that education administrators did not want to hear. She offered excellent analysis on the issue of Christianity in the classroom, pointing out how secular humanism had become, in essence, a religion. She wrote, since the First Amendment seems to prohibit the school from teaching belief in God and his moral commandments, the school must not be permitted to teach that there isn't any God, that God did not create the world and did not give us his moral commandments. End of quote. The problem was that parents often were unaware of what was taught in the classroom. And when parents spoke up, the general attitude of most public school administrators was, quote, if you don't like it, take your child out and to a private school. Okay, just to conclude. Less than a generation after World War II, Protestant churches drifted apart. You have modernist churches keeping pace with cultural change and traditional churches attempting to hold a biblical perspective. The example of the Southern Baptist Convention showed that conservatives could reestablish leadership. However, this outcome tended to be the exception. As for public education in the late 20th century, many parents were unaware on how much educational theorists had pushed aside Christian principles. It was clear that there would be challenging times ahead for Bible-believing Christians. I mean, they were viewed as cultural subversives. So we see that for Bible-believing Christians, the future looked like further struggle to deal with powerful secular forces. Thank you.